Hello, my name is Larry Hamilton, and I'm going to share with you today a PowerPoint presentation that I had made previously with the Premier Health Network, and that was done in conjunction with the partnership agreement that they made with the city of Piqua on March of this year. So what I want to do is basically give you an understanding of what it is that I am doing at 655 North Main Street in the city of Piqua, and what that has to do with what I think is going to be a community benefit in general as a result of a partnership between the city of Piqua and Premier Health Network. So what you're seeing initially here is my facility at 655 North Main Street, and this is called the Randolph and McCulloch Freedom Struggle Complex. And this is an overview of what I envision for the city of Piqua. This is going to become a learning center or interpretive center associated with the Randolph narrative and the effort to promote a educational opportunity for the Upper Miami Valley. The name of the presentation that I'll be making this day is The Community Benefit, a 400-year memorial observance and Piqua leadership in healing America. Now, I have come before the Piqua City Commission on numerous occasions in an effort to promote an observance of the 400-year memorial of the arrival of African laborers in America at Point Comfort, which is just in the vicinity of Jamestown, Virginia. And what I'm hoping to do is tie that observance to the effort to promote a partnership between the city of Piqua and Premier Health Network or other organizations and corporations that might be interested in some kind of a joint venture in association with the city of Piqua. What I like to do initially is begin with a prayer. I'm praying that on the 400th anniversary of the introduction of African enslaved labor into America near Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, that the city of Piqua, in partnership with Premier Health Network, might acknowledge slavery as America's original sin and recognize the contributions to the health and wellness in America made through the oppression and exploitation of Black lives, and that our elected officials and Christian medical and health personnel will take an activist role in doing the right thing in helping to heal the nation in its responsibility and role as a community benefit. And I would also encourage you to take a look at the YouTube video titled My Personal Vision for Piqua. By way of introduction, I have been a teacher or had been a teacher at Piqua High School for 30 years. I was hired in 1971 as a result of having been recruited by Dr. Mitchell Pedroff, representing the Piqua Board of Education, who appeared at Central State University, my alma mater. And on that occasion, we talked, and he communicated to me that Piqua was interested in establishing a Black History course at Piqua High School, which greatly interested me. And subsequently, I decided not to go to Philadelphia, that was heavily recruiting me, and to come and link my fortunes and prosperity to the city of Piqua. So I came to Piqua, Ohio in about March of 1971 and began my teaching career at what was called Piqua Central High School at that time. Initially, I was one of two people of color or minority teacher persons on staff at Piqua High School, and eventually, over a period of 30 years, 27 of those 30 years, I would be the only person of color on staff at Piqua High School. So this is something that became extremely important to me. One might say it became my raison d'etre. It was my real reason for being in Piqua in the first place. And later on, I had the good fortune of working on my master's degree at Wright State University and coming in contact with Alex Haley, who was on his inaugural tour of Roots, and that made even more a purposeful kind of recognition on my role as a Black history teacher at Piqua High School, that I had something key to offer Piqua and the Upper Miami Valley. I began soon after my effort to emulate the experience of Alex Haley in Roots by talking with my own grandmother about our family history. And it wasn't long after that that I began to recognize that I had somewhat of a calling, a ministry to perform in association with my teaching at Piqua High School. And subsequently, after retirement, I fully engulfed myself in that reason for being and that ministry to be performed by recognizing that we in America have a responsibility to build a more perfect union, not to simply settle for what it is that had existed in the past, but to promote that which would be more desirable in the way of creating a healing and reconciliation within our national fabric and bringing together a more perfect union. And we recognize that America is a country that is very diverse, and yet we have to find ways by which we can work positively with one another and seek to be an inclusive historical society. You'll see in connection with this slide that it's very important to seek understanding before being understood. And what we're referring to here is the connection with history as a mandatory subject matter in Ohio as well as across the nation. And most of the things that are taught within our classrooms are areas that we never want to lose track of, that we always want to remember. And you hear within a number of occasions references being made to events that have taken place in history, with references being never forget. Never forget the sinking of the Lusitania. Never forget the Holocaust and the mistreatment of Jews in Germany and across Europe. Never forget, of course, we just celebrated, or recognized, I should say, the 2011 incident that brought down the Twin Towers. And again, you heard over and over references to never forget. But for some reason, when it comes to the hard history, the very complicated history associated with slavery and racism in America, we always are told, or it's suggested, that we should just simply forget about it, get over it, let's move on. But that's not what this is about. And I want to basically provide you with a little synopsis of the 400-year observance with the introduction of black laborers into America. It's important for us to begin with the knowledge that European royal families gave charter or the origin to corporations that were permitted to represent the crowned heads of Europe. And in so doing, they were permitted to go to extraordinary degrees to acquire wealth, to make prosperous those royal families of Europe. And one of the ways in which they did that was to extract labor from the interior of the African continent, and of course to transport by way of the transatlantic slave trade those laborers from Africa, the west coast of Africa, to the New World. And in so doing, these corporations were there at the very beginning of the creation of the British colonial state in North America. And as such, we wanted to make sure that people were aware of the capitalist nature by which profit was made off of the backs of African laborers in America. Now, we also wanted to make sure that there's a carryover recognition in association with these corporations into our contemporary society. We wanted to have you recognize that there is what is called a community benefit in association with some nonprofit corporations in America. Now, as I prepared to retire, created a 501c3. So I'm somewhat familiar with nonprofit organizations. There are some nonprofit organizations that have differing levels or status with the Internal Revenue Service, but they also retain what is referred to as a community benefit, meaning essentially that they don't pay taxes. And we have that situation, for example, in association with hospitals. Some hospitals have a nonprofit status and they do not pay taxes, but in turn they are supposed to provide a community benefit. Now, some of these hospitals have the opportunity to decide what that community benefit shall be. And it's my contention that cities and other regions in which these corporations exist ought to be able to encourage those corporations to consider their request for community benefit efforts to promote their agenda rather than the agenda of the corporation. So corporate philanthropy in the minds of many people is illegitimate spending by powerful corporate elite of someone else's money in an attempt to bypass democratic allocation of taxes. So that's important for us to keep in mind as we move along and look at the effort on the part of hospitals, particularly in the Upper Miami Valley, like Premier Health and the Upper Valley Medical Center. On March 25th of 2019, there was a presentation before the Piqua City Commission in which Steve Staley and the president of UVMC, Premier Health Network, made a presentation to the city of Piqua. It was a check for $280,000 in which they were announcing that they were willing to partner with the city of Piqua in support of Lock 9. a park project that the city had long been attempting to promote and get off the ground. I wanted UVMC and the officials at Premier Health Network to understand what that partnership meant in connection with the historical heritage associated with Lock 9 in Piqua. So when Premier Health Network made that check for $280,000 to the city of Piqua, they were also linking themselves to that historical heritage associated with Lock 9. And in association with the 1846 campaign, I wanted people to understand, particularly if we're making an effort to make history an inclusive historical heritage, that when the Randolph Freedmen arrived at Lock 9 in 1846, the response on the part of the city of Piqua by way of its sheriffs, according to local newspaper accounts, was that the sheriff greeted the Randolph Freedmen with a denial of an opportunity to disembark from the canal boats and to quench their thirst at the town well. And his instructions basically were keep on moving. So Piqua wasn't displaying any real significant hospitality at that particular point in time, but there were always citizens who were willing to go above and beyond the call of duty, and apparently there were people who went ahead of the canal boats who rode out to the Johnston farm, recognizing that there was a spring house there, and requested apparently the opportunity for the canal boats to park and allow the Randolph Freedmen to quench their thirst at the spring house. So we know that that was an act of considerable hospitality and may have been initiated largely to the urging of Mrs. Johnston, whom we understand was a Quaker and perhaps had more tolerant and inclusive inclinations because of her religious background. It's important for all of us who have a relationship with God to recognize that if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. So says or refers to 1 John 3, verses 17 and 18. And that's something that is very much a part of the social justice outlook. What I want to also talk about with you is something that allows the medical community to have an appreciation of the contribution on the part of Black people to the health and well-being of the American society, in spite of the legacy of slavery in America. One of the stories that you may not be aware of is the account of Onesimus. Onesimus, which is also a slave name associated with scriptures. Onesimus happened to be a slave of a prominent family in Boston, Massachusetts, a family, in this case, Onesimus was owned by Cotton Mather. The Mather family were prominent in the operation of Harvard University. They didn't know everything, and you would think that there would be much instruction on the part of the master to slave, but it also went the other direction. And in this case, the slave Onesimus was able to teach his master some information about inoculation techniques that he had learned in Africa. what he taught his master basically was instrumental in saving the lives of thousands of people in the Boston area as a result of a smallpox epidemic. So it's important for us to keep in mind that there has always been some level of African inventiveness and creativity that has been a significant contribution to world civilization. I also want to point out that in the case of Richard Allen here, in the period of the infancy of the United States was just being formed in the period around 1790. In this period of time, there was another epidemic. It happened to be associated with Philadelphia at this time. In a 2-month period, more than 5,000 people had died as a result of their exposure to the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 in Philadelphia. Richard Allen, who was the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and his associates had created a mutual care organization that aided the fight against yellow fever in Philadelphia. And his efforts apparently saved large numbers of lives, but unfortunately he was repaid for his efforts by being accused of having stolen the money of people whom he actually was taking care of. To that end, he wrote a narrative, a protest refuting the allegations that were being directed at him, but it's like no good deed goes unpunished. But we want people to recognize that Richard Allen and people like him were willing to go above and beyond to answer the call upon their lives to treat their neighbors with a great deal of respect and care and compassionate mercy. One of the stories that is really painful to share about the master-slave relationship is the story of Dr. Sims. Dr. Sims was a slave owner who was credited with becoming the father of gynecology. Gynecology is associated with the examination of the womb or pelvic area of women, and that practice was brought into being largely because of his master-slave relationship over his slave women, whom he was able to subjugate to participation in treatment and hone his skills of practice in examination of the private areas of women. That was something that was very, very important to recognize, that effort that resulted in the exploitation of his slave women resulted actually in the development of the profession of gynecology. Now, as we transition to another area that is of importance, we recognize that religion also, unfortunately, plays a key role in the development of slavery in America. And one of the areas that was being referenced in terms of the Jesuits and their creation of Georgetown University was the sale of nearly 300 of their slaves downstream into Louisiana during a period of time when the East Coast was actually moving away from the hard enslavement labor of African Americans, and that transitioning from the tobacco region to the sugarcane area and cotton production areas of Louisiana and the more south western areas. It was important that we recognize that the sale of those slaves was the means by which Georgetown University was able to be maintained and was able to survive a period of dark financial foreboding. But it nevertheless underscores the recognition that every aspect of society and the important institutions of America have benefited from the enslavement of African people in America. So you've got bad blood, is what the members of the horrible experiment in Tuskegee were told. They were battling syphilis. They were told that they were being treated, but in reality, many of the people were not being treated and were used as guinea pigs to discover the effects or impact of syphilis on the lives of these black people. So it was just another travesty or miscarriage of justice that we associated with being black and being subject to this level of social inequality in America. Another area is the issue of Henrietta Lacks. And this was a topic that I can recall being introduced to by the YWCA reading circle that issued that as a subject matter. We know that Henrietta Lacks was being treated for cancer, and that without knowledge, there was an allegation, at least, that cells had been removed from Henrietta without the permission of her family, and that that cell line created what is called an immortalized cell line that continues to be beneficial in the treatment of cancer and other kinds of medical ailments. And unfortunately, it was alleged, at least for quite some time, there was little or no compensation on the part of the family members of Mrs. Lacks. But again, a tremendous amount of contribution to the lives and well-beings of American citizens as a result of this, again, miscarriage of justice. I wanted to also share with people the fact that this ministry that I refer to came about as a result of a moment of epiphany that occurred in January of 2005. And while studying my Sunday school lesson, I had a flash and a mind-altering moment in which I was compelled to write down "right" or "let it be right." And then subsequently, just as quickly, got recognizing individual greatness in or through historical testament. I was both reading my Sunday school lesson and watching a program on America's Black Journal at that particular time. But what I want to call your attention to is the fact that the name or the title of the lesson that day was "Jesus Called for Total Commitment." And for me, that was extremely instructive and confirming in making a total commitment to promote an inclusive historical heritage by way of the right concept. What we often hear in our society is that greatness is determined by the level of wealth one has been able to accumulate, or the amount of power, either political or military power, that one has become associated with, or other kinds of, worldly capitalist acquisitions by which people gain fame and notoriety or celebrity in the United States. But on a biblical basis, utilizing a more Christ-like model, we're told not to behave in that manner. We're told not to practice that kind of behavior or conduct in which we lord over the lives of our fellow human beings. But rather, what we should be doing is becoming the servants of others. That's the Christian model that we want to emulate. And it's important that we, as followers of Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, follow His leadership in sacrifice for those others who would come after Him. The right concept later on developed into a recognition that some people had not been given any value within our society for their contributions to our society. And as a result, almost all of the accolades or all of the areas of contribution or historical importance were given to people of one particular gender and identity. And as a consequence, white males, because of their political power given to them constitutionally, were the ones whom we awarded what I call ownership identity. And so I wanted to again apply the right concept in association with doing the right thing to people who had historically been excluded from what I call ownership identity. That is, any identification with public properties. So that we should, moving forward, make every effort to create a partnership with civic groups to name bridges or parks or streets or buildings for those people who were locked out historically or denied the opportunity to have any public ownership identity to city properties or public properties in America. And in so doing, we would begin to honor and value all of our citizens within the United States of America and even beyond. One of the things that has greatly disturbed me about the lack of an inclusive historical heritage was that we often promote ourselves as being inclusive when the reality is that when we talk about sharing our heritage, we don't often see that heritage being applied to particularly, for example, people of color. When we see references being made to the challenge of our ancestors and made in reference to areas like the Johnson Farm, which is one of the largest attended sites as a part of the Ohio History Connection, we don't see the presence of a people of color or blacks. We do see, of course, the Indian Museum, but we don't see the representation or inclusion of black people, particularly the descendants of the Randolph Freedmen, as being pioneers in settling this area of the upper Miami Valley. And that's something that we need to recognize. As painful as it is, this is a history that has excluded and made efforts to expel a Black and Indian presence together. In fact, in the same year of 1846. And so these are, again, are difficult and challenging lessons of our history, but they are very much worthwhile in dealing with and simply can't be ignored or denied or trivialized if we want to reconcile and make America a great nation. One of the things that I wanted to call attention to in association with this effort to make our area at least a model in moving forward America's efforts to be more inclusive of a historical heritage was the effort to bring to the attention of the Johnston Farm an obligation or responsibility to be more inclusive, and in offering the Friends of the Johnston Farm Society an opportunity to create an exhibit at that site with the newly received monies through the Ohio History Connection, and the effort to build an additional site at the Johnston Farm of the Miami Erie Canal Museum, that was a fitting location for an exhibit for the story of the Randolph Freedmen and their efforts to settle in the upper Miami Valley. We know, of course, that story involving the movement of the canal boats with almost 400 Randolph Freedmen through Piqua up into New Bremen, where they were met with a hostile mob, denying them their land that had been purchased for them, over 3,200 acres in Mercer County. And so that is a story that is rather painful to share and relate, but it's very much a part of the history of the United States, and it's a part of the history of manumission in America, and also part of the history that we're dealing with now on a contemporary basis as we talk about the American flag and patriotism and other kinds of issues that are impacting our ability to socially be more inclusive within our society. So bottom line is that my wife and I, in an effort to promote that inclusive historical heritage, made an offer to the Johnston Farm of $10,846 for inclusion of an exhibit at that site within the Miami Erie Canal Museum. Unfortunately, the management and or leadership of the Friends of the Johnston Farm declined that offer. An offer subsequently was made to the city of Piqua, and the city of Piqua balked or decided not to be receptive to that overture of $10,846, by which they might have been able to carve out some area of importance to manifest the value that they said was associated with the city of Piqua, particularly since after having been expelled from New Bremen, the Randolph Freedmen were pushed back down the canal and subsequently were allowed to live opposite the city of Piqua in Rossville. So the hope was that Piqua would be a little bit more inclusive. It had a history of having some tolerance in which the Randolphs themselves referred to Piqua as being more hospitable, a more hospitable place to live, particularly in association with the mistreatment that they had received at New Bremen and in Mercer County. So what we're doing is attempting to promote a leadership for Piqua, and that by way of my personal vision that is connected to the effort that I am encouraging by way of the existing partnership that was brought about earlier this year between the Premier Health Network and the City of Piqua as a result of the Premier Health Network having made a contribution to the City of Piqua in the amount of over $250,000. And what I'm specifically proposing is that next to the facility that has been purchased by my wife and I in order to share that Randolph narrative, there is land or space adjacent to 655 North Main Street, or the Randolph and McCulloch Freedom Struggle complex there in the white that you see. And adjacent to that area is an area that was the old area of the Miami Erie Canal, which is one of the reasons why this was such an attractive purchase by my wife and I, because the story of the Randolph Freedmen was very much tied to their trip north on the Miami Erie Canal. And if you can look a little bit north of that white building there, you'll see also the bike path, which is something that is being promoted in the upper Miami Valley, and the Miami River, which is also an asset in the way of canoeing and fishing and recreational opportunities that is also advocated in connection with that partnering proposal between Premier Health Network and the City of Piqua. We also want to point out that the site just to the north and east of our building is an area that also might be utilized as an opportunity for building a facility that would be complementary to the existing facility that is owned by my wife and I at 655 North Main Street. So we would hope and propose that the City of Piqua partner again with Premier Health, or again, any other corporation that might be interested in a role of reconciliation and advancing the efforts to build a more perfect union in an effort to also promote an inclusive historical heritage. So what I would like to see done with that area is to have that area be built upon and a pyramid-shaped form of architecture be developed at that site that would also complement the pyramid that is being contemplated for construction at 655 North Main Street also. And the proposed area adjacent to 655 North Main Street would have a community benefit associated with it. And one of the things that we would want to promote is a free clinic. And that free clinic is something that could be financed and subsidized, again, by way of organizations and corporate boards that have a community benefit, in as much as they do not pay taxes and serve the interest of the community by way of creating grants and financing community projects. So we see some service on the part of people on boards at the Premier Health Network Foundation. We also see some of these same people in association with the Piqua Community Foundation, which again seems to offer a seamless, kind of fit in terms of moving forward towards a greater community benefit. One of the things that we want to call your attention to is that there is a resolution that has been in effect for quite some time in Piqua that recognizes the effort in connection with the Randolph Freedmen and recognizes the effort in promotion of a greater degree of diversity within the city of Piqua. And that effort is supposed to be encouraged and expanded upon to be offered or promoted to local corporations, businesses, and schools. And so that is something that is ongoing, and we want to make sure that the citizens of Piqua are aware of in the way of stiffening their resolve to be compliant with those things that they had previously agreed upon. One of the things we also want to promote is that, again, there ought to be an outreach of the institutions governing our civic society in the way of a mutual responsibility or relationship existing between organizations like PAC, for example, that represent the church within the city of Piqua and the Upper Miami Valley, educational institutions like Piqua High School, and of course the health care providers within the area like Premier Health Network or even Kettering Health Network. We want people who are totally committed to uplifting our community and making Piqua and the Upper Miami Valley a more better and prosperous place in which to live. And we can do that largely by creating a free clinic at that site and have it serve as a healthcare facility in Piqua and address a number of issues in the way of education and address also the inequity, the health care inequity that we see prevalent within America. And to a large degree, that prevalence of healthcare inequity is associated with income level. So we want people to recognize that there are a lot of people in the same boat. And if people who are not making a lot of money, those are the same people who largely are affected by health concerns within our society. And obviously, those whose income has suffered are particularly associated with people of color. So we want people to recognize that it's important that we maintain what we call an ownership identity in connection with the adjacent property at 655 North Main Street. And that one of the ownership identity options that I would like to see included for that space is a recognition of the creative genius of an ancient Egyptian or Kemet architect and physician by the name of Imhotep. Imhotep was the guiding force behind the creation of the step pyramid and the pyramids at Giza that are one of the premier monuments of the ancient world. And so he also is associated with being one of the first real physicians. And even though Hippocrates of Greece is given that status, there would be an equal representation on the part of those who profess that Imhotep ought to also have that level of ownership identity in America. So these are the kinds of things that we are advocating, and we want to promote by way of, again, the Sankofa bird that is represented in any event. We recognize that the Sankofa is the symbol of West Africa that is symbolized by the bird flying forward but looking backward. And the message is that we ought to always look back and retrieve that which was lost and bring it forward into the present and utilize it for our future growth and development. So that Sankofa bird is going to be utilized particularly at 655 North Main Street, but we want to recognize the pyramid design concept featuring my mother at the top, my grandmother at the bottom left, and her grandmother, born a slave in Kentucky in 1847. So the message is that we ought to always look back, and we ought to always appreciate those whose struggles we profit from and benefit from, and the same is true in the way of a community benefit for Piqua and our nation. So bottom line is that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, and I recognize again that I am particularly weak in many areas as far as advocacy and promoting doing the right thing, and the building of the Randolph and McCulloch Freedom Struggle Complex, but I know that I serve one who is able. And because he is able to make provision for the vision. And with that, we'll conclude our presentation and encourage the citizens of Piqua to embrace the community benefit proposal of building upon the adjacent property at 655 North Main Street, and having that property have ownership identity with Imhotep. Thank you.